right, Smoky. Ready. Let's move.
July in the Mississippi Delta, heat index 108. A sheriff's deputy is taping an eviction notice to the front door of a house that has been standing since 1971. The woman inside is 75 years old. She has been telling people for 8 months that the debt is not real. Nobody read the paperwork. Across the road, a man with $34, a scarred German shepherd, and nowhere to be is reading it right now. He has 4 hours. If he helps her, he loses the only steady work he has had in 2 months. Smoky is already moving toward the door. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The gravel turnout off Highway 1 sat a quarter-mile south of a crossroads that did not have a name, only a leaning stop sign with a bullet hole through the O in a drainage ditch that had not drained properly since the last flood season. The turnout itself was nothing more than a widened shoulder of crushed limestone and packed red clay, just large enough for a single vehicle to pull off the road without blocking the narrow lane, and it was bordered on its western edge by a stand of pecan trees whose broad, heavy canopies threw a wedge of shade that began around 2 in the afternoon and lasted, if the clouds cooperated, until just past 6. That 4-hour window was the reason Jax Harlan had chosen this particular patch of Mississippi earth over every other patch of Mississippi earth available to a man who owned nothing that did not fit inside the cab of a 2004 Chevrolet Silverado with 231,000 miles on its odometer and a passenger seat that no longer reclined because the liver had broken off somewhere outside of Meridian and he had not had the money or the reason to fix it. He had been here 11 days. 11 days in a town whose name he had learned only because it was printed on the water tower visible from the turnout. The paint faded to a pale ghost of blue that looked in the late afternoon light like a bruise that had almost finished healing. The town sat at the edge of the delta where the flat black soil cotton country began its slow transition into the low rolling hills to the east, and everything about the place carried the specific weight of a community that had been quietly contracting for decades. There was a Dollar General with a gravel parking lot at the north end, a feed store that was open 3 days a week, a courthouse with a brick facade and tall windows that would have been handsome in 1952, and now looked merely tired, its air conditioning unit a rusted industrial box on the roof that had not functioned, according to Curtis, since the summer before the pandemic. The heat inside that building, Curtis had said, was something you had to experience to understand. Jax had not yet been inside. He had no reason to go to a courthouse. He had spent enough of his life in rooms where other people decided things about him. The heat outside was its own living entity. July in the Mississippi Delta did not arrive the way heat arrived in other places. It did not build gradually through a morning and peak in the afternoon and then slowly, mercifully relent. It was waiting when you opened your eyes. It was pressed against the glass of the truck windows at 5:30 in the morning like something that had been leaning there all night, patient and heavy and utterly without sympathy. By 7, the air had a texture. By 9, it had a taste, metallic and close, like breathing through a wet wool blanket that had been draped over the entire state. The heat index, according to the weather readout on Jax's phone when the phone still had charge, had not dropped below 103 in 6 days. On the worst afternoon, it had reached 111. The asphalt on Highway 1 had gone soft at the edges, and the smell of it, that dark petroleum sweetness baking up from the road surface, mixed with the dust and the cut grass smell from the fields and the faint, ever-present undercurrent of standing water from the drainage ditch, created an atmosphere that was not merely hot, but inhabited, as if the air itself had a pulse and a disposition, and it did not care whether you survived in it or not. Jax survived in it the way he survived everything, through discipline, through reduction, through the systematic elimination of every variable that was not immediately necessary to the continuation of breathing. He had a system. The system was not comfortable, but it functioned. He slept in the truck cab with both windows down 3 inches, enough to let the air circulate but not enough for a hand to reach through. A calibration that was not paranoia but the kind of automatic tactical assessment that 12 years in the United States Army had welded into the architecture of his nervous system so permanently that he did not experience it as a decision. It was simply the way he processed a space, entry points, sight lines, vulnerability. The tailgate faced east, so the morning sun hit the bed of the truck first and gave him an extra 20 minutes before the cab became unlivable. His canvas bag sat in the footwell of the passenger side, packed in the specific order he had maintained since his third deployment, documents on top in a sealed plastic bag, then the clean shirt, then the utilities. Everything else was expendable. The bag could be grabbed with one hand in under 2 seconds. He had never needed to test this in the civilian world, but the readiness was there like a second heartbeat, constant and below the level of conscious thought. The fan had been a luxury. A small battery-powered unit, black plastic, the size of a dinner plate, purchased for $11 from the Dollar General with money he could not afford to spend. It had run for 2 days, pulling the thick air across his face and Smoky's flank with a thin mechanical whir that was almost in the darkest hours of those 2 nights, something close to comfort. It had died on the 3rd morning with a small click and a silence that felt in the motionless heat of the cab like a punishment specifically designed for a man who had allowed himself to want something. He had not replaced it. He had $11 less in the world and nothing to show for it, and the lesson was the same lesson the world had been teaching him for 3 years. Do not want things. Smoky lay on the bench seat beside him with her belly pressed against the vinyl, her thick double coat a cruel evolutionary gift in this climate, her breathing slow and measured in the way of an animal that had been trained to regulate its own systems in conditions far worse than a Mississippi summer. She was not comfortable. Jax knew this the way he knew his own discomfort, through the specific signals of a body he had lived beside for so long that her physical vocabulary had become indistinguishable from his own. The slight increase in her respiration rate, the way she repositioned every 40 minutes, shifting her weight to press a different section of her undercoat against the marginally cooler surface beneath her. The amber eyes that tracked him in the dark, not with anxiety, but with a steady patient vigilance that said, in the only language she possessed, I am here, and I'm watching, and I will not stop watching. She drank more water in this heat. He made sure of that before he made sure of anything else. The water jug sat in the shade under the truck during the day, refilled every morning at the spigot behind the feed store, and Smoky's collapsible bowl was the first thing he reached for when the shade arrived and the cab temperature dropped from unsurvivable to merely brutal. She drank. He drank after. This was not selflessness. This was the operational hierarchy of a 2-member unit in which the working dog's functionality was mission-critical and the handler's needs were secondary. The Army had trained him to think this way. The Army had then discharged him and Smoky together and had not in the 37 pages of paperwork that accompanied that discharge included a single sentence about what a man was supposed to do with a hierarchy of care when there was no longer a mission to care for. The VA claim sat in the glove box in a manila envelope that was starting to soften at the edges from the humidity. 60% disability, rated and approved after 14 months of processing, which was, according to the veteran service officer who had helped him file, actually fast. The 60% covered the shoulder, which had been rebuilt twice and would never rotate past 90 degrees again, and the hearing loss in his left ear, which manifested as a constant low tone that was always there, like a television left on in a room he could not find. 60% translated to $1,361 a month before taxes. It was not enough. It was not enough by a margin that was mathematically precise and emotionally devastating. And the reason it was not enough was a single question on a single form that Jax had read, understood, and refused to answer. The question had been on the intake assessment. Page 6, Section 4, a checkbox grid under the heading Psychological and Behavioral Health. It asked, in the flat bureaucratic language that the federal government uses to discuss the interior lives of the men and women it sends to war, whether he had ever experienced thoughts of harming himself or others. The question did not ask whether he had acted on such thoughts. It did not ask whether such thoughts were fleeting or sustained, managed or unmanaged, past or present. It asked only whether they had existed, and they had existed. Of course they had existed. They existed in every man Jax had served with who had seen what he had seen and done what he had done and come home to a country that thanked him at airports and then lost his paperwork for 14 months. But Jax had looked at that question, and he had looked at the small print beneath it, and he had thought about the ways that a yes answer could travel through systems he did not control, into files he could not access, in front of people who did not know him, and would never meet Smoky and would never understand that the thoughts were a weather pattern, not a destination. He had thought about the men he knew who had answered yes, and had found themselves in mandatory programs and on watch lists and in databases that did not have expiration dates. And he had left the box unchecked. He had left the box unchecked, and he had signed the form, and he had submitted it knowing that the decision would cost him the PTSD rating that would have added another $800 a month to his disability check. $800, that was the difference between surviving and not surviving, between a room with a door that locked and the bench seat of a Silverado in the Mississippi Delta in July. He did the math every night. He lay in the dark with Smoky's breathing beside him, and the cicadas screaming from the pecan trees, and he ran the numbers the way he used to run pre-mission checklists, methodically without emotion, looking for the variable he had missed, the adjustment that would make the equation balance. $34 in his wallet, the 60% check deposited on the first of each month. Curtis's work when Curtis had work, which was not steady and not guaranteed, and not enough even when it came. Gas for the truck, food for Smoky, then food for himself. The phone bill, which he needed for the phone, which he needed for Curtis to reach him, which he needed for the work, which he needed to eat. Every night the math came out the same way. Every night the number at the bottom was a negative number. And negative numbers in the specific economy of a man sleeping in his truck meant something was going to break, and the only question was which thing and when. He could reopen the claim. The veteran service officer had told him this. He could file a supplemental, disclose the PTSD, submit to the evaluation, and wait another 8 to 14 months for the system to process what it should have processed the first time. 8 to 14 months. The number sat in his mind like a stone in a boot. He could feel it with every step, but removing it required stopping, and stopping, for Jax Harlan, had never been an option that his body understood. Forward was the only direction that existed. Forward, even when forward meant a gravel turnout and a dead fan and $34, and the sound of the cicadas at night building to a frequency that lived at the exact edge of a sound he had heard in Fallujah that he had never been able to name to anyone. The cicadas, they started at dusk, a low scattered ticking from the trees that built over the first hour of darkness into a pulsing, rhythmic wall of sound that pressed against the truck from every direction. In other parts of the country, in other seasons of his life, Jax might have found the sound unremarkable, the background noise of a southern summer, no different from the frogs or the distant hum of trucks on the highway. But here, in this specific heat, at this specific frequency, the cicadas hit a register that sat precisely on top of something else. Something that lived in the part of his brain that the VA intake form had been asking about. The sound was not the same as the sound from Fallujah. It was not a helicopter. It was not a weapon. It was not any of the things that civilians imagined when they imagined what haunted a man who had been to war. It was smaller than that. More specific, a mechanical tone, high and steady, that had preceded something he did not replay in his conscious mind and could not stop his unconscious mind from cataloging, indexing, and storing in a file that had no label and no expiration date. He managed it by counting. He had started the count on a night he did not remember choosing to start it, somewhere in Tennessee months ago, lying in the truck in a Walmart parking lot at 2 a.m. with Smoky's head on his thigh and the sound of the cicadas, or the memory of the other sound, or the place where the two sounds merged into a single frequency that made his hands grip the steering wheel until the knuckles went white. He had started counting. Slowly, one number per breath. He never started over. The count was continuous, a thread that ran through every night and connected each night to the one before it. And the connection mattered because it meant the nights were survivable, each one proof that the last one had not killed him. He was at 4,847. The number meant nothing to anyone in the world except Jax Harlan, and it meant everything to Jax Harlan and Smoky, lying beside him in the dark with her amber eyes half closed and her ears tracking the cicadas with the calm, systematic attention of an animal who had been trained to catalog every sound in her environment and rank it by threat level. Smoky knew the count was happening, even if she could not know what it meant. She knew because his breathing changed when he counted. It slowed. It steadied. And when it steadied, her tail, heavy and warm against his leg, would thump once, softly, a single metronome beat of acknowledgement in the dark. They had bled on the same soil. They had been discharged from the same machine. They slept in the same truck, on the same bench seat, in the same heat, and neither of them had anyone else in the world, and neither of them needed anyone else in the world, and this was either the saddest truth Jax knew or the only one that still held weight. He had not decided which. He was not sure the distinction mattered. The morning of the 11th day came the way every morning came. Hot, still, the light already heavy and golden by 6 pouring through the windshield like something poured from a furnace. Jax opened his eyes. Smoky was already awake, her head raised, her ears forward, watching something through the passenger window. He followed her gaze across the road, across the shallow ditch, to the small clapboard house with the tin roof and the screen porch, and the yard where a single magnolia tree threw a circle of shade that was, even from this distance, visibly deeper and cooler than anything the pecan trees above his truck could offer. The house had been there every morning for 11 days. He had not paid it any particular attention. He was about to. The sheriff's cruiser came from the north, moving slowly, the way law enforcement vehicles move on rural roads when the driver is looking for an address rather than responding to a call. It was a white Ford Explorer with the county seal on the door and a light bar on the roof that caught the early sun and threw brief, sharp flashes of reflection across the road surface as it passed. Jax registered it before he was fully conscious of registering it, the way he registered every vehicle that entered his peripheral awareness, a silent inventory conducted by a part of his brain that had never received the order to stand down, make, model, speed, direction, number of occupants. Threat assessment. The assessment came back low and automatic, and he did not act on it. But his hand, which had been resting on Smoky's shoulder, went still, and Smoky, reading the change in his body the way she read every change in his body, lifted her head from the seat and oriented her ears toward the sound of the tires on gravel as the cruiser slowed and pulled to a stop on the shoulder across the road, directly in front of the clapboard house with the tin roof. The deputy who stepped out was a young man, late 20s, built like someone who had played high school football at a position that required size but not exceptional speed. He wore the tan uniform of the county sheriff's department and a wide-brimmed hat that he adjusted against the sun as he stood beside the cruiser and consulted a clipboard. His body language carried the specific posture of a man performing a task he had performed before and did not enjoy but would complete with the methodical, unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that the task was part of the job, and the job was the thing that paid for the house and the truck and the life that waited at the end of each shift. He was not aggressive. He was not tense. He was clerical. And that Jax knew from years of navigating institutions that processed human beings like inventory was its own kind of danger. The clerk does not need to be cruel. The clerk only needs to follow the procedure, and the procedure, in Jax's experience, had never once been written with mercy as a variable in its equation. The deputy crossed the road carrying a single sheet of paper and a roll of clear packing tape. He walked up the 3 wooden steps to the screen porch of the clapboard house, opened the screen door, and taped the paper to the front door with 4 precise strips, 1 on each edge. Then he knocked, 3 knocks, evenly spaced, with the flat of his knuckle rather than his fist. Professional, measured, the knock of a man who is required to knock and would prefer that no one answered. Someone answered. The screen door opened inward, and a woman appeared in the gap between the door and the frame, and even from across the road, even through the shimmer of heat that was already beginning to rise from the asphalt, Jax could see that she was old and that she was not surprised. She stood in the doorway the way a person stands when they have been expecting a visitor they hoped would not come. Her body angled slightly away from the deputy as if she could deflect whatever he carried by simply not facing it directly. She was small, not frail, but reduced, the way a person is reduced by decades of physical work and southern heat, and the specific grinding, compounding weight of being a black woman in the Mississippi Delta for 3/4 of a century. She wore a house dress, pale blue, and her hair was white and pulled back, and her hands, which Jax could see because she was holding the screen door open with one of them, were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime using them for purposes that did not include leisure. The deputy spoke to her. Jax could not hear the words from across the road, but he could read the interaction the way he had been trained to read interactions in places where the language was not his own, and survival depended on understanding what the body said when the mouth was speaking something else. The deputy was explaining. The woman was listening. The deputy gestured toward the paper taped to the door. The woman looked at it but did not touch it. The deputy said something else, shorter this time, and the woman nodded once. A small vertical movement that could have meant "I understand," or could have meant "I have heard this before," or could have meant "I am too tired to fight you on my own porch at 7 in the morning in July." The deputy waited a moment, then turned and walked back to the cruiser. He did not look back. He pulled away heading south, and the dust from his tires hung in the still air for a long time after the sound of his engine had faded. The woman stood in the doorway. She did not move to take the paper from the door. She stood there with one hand on the frame and the other at her side, and she looked out across her yard, past the magnolia tree, past the ditch, and for a single moment her gaze crossed the road and passed over the truck and over Jax and over Smoky, and continued on to the cotton field beyond without stopping, without registering, without seeing. He was invisible to her the way he was invisible to everyone. A man in a truck on the side of the road, a piece of the landscape that did not require attention. She went back inside. The screen door closed behind her with a soft wooden slap that carried across the road in the still air like a period at the end of a sentence. Jax sat in the truck and looked at the paper taped to the door. He could read it. Not the words, not from this distance, but the format, the layout, the specific arrangement of text blocks and legal headings and bold print sections that he recognized the way a mechanic recognizes the layout of an engine bay without needing to read the model number. He had seen that document before. He had held that document in his own hands in a courthouse in Virginia 3 years ago when his wife's attorney had filed the motion that took the house, and he had spent 3 weeks after that in a law library with fluorescent lights and a water fountain that made a sound like a small animal dying, teaching himself to read the language that the legal system uses to take things from people who do not know how to read it. The document on the door was an eviction notice. He was certain of this. And he was certain of it not because of the size of the text or the color of the paper, but because of the way the woman had looked at it and not touched it. The way a person looks at something they have been expecting, the way you expect a diagnosis you already know, with a stillness that is not calm, but is instead the absolute absence of surprise, which is its own kind of devastation. He should not get involved. The thought arrived with the clarity and the weight of an order issued from a command structure he no longer served, but whose authority his body still recognized without question. He should not get involved because involvement cost things, and the things it cost were things he could not afford, and the economy of his survival was so precisely calibrated, so reduced to its absolute minimum, that a single variable introduced from outside could collapse the entire structure. Curtis had called him last night, 3 days of work starting this morning. The tow lot had taken 2 wrecks from a highway accident and a repossessed flatbed that needed the brake lines replaced, and Curtis needed a second pair of hands for all 3 jobs, and 3 days at Curtis's rate meant $180, which was the most consistent income Jax had been offered in 2 months, which was gas and food and a new fan and the phone bill and a margin, however thin, however temporary, between himself and the arithmetic that came out negative every night. The work started at 8. It was 7:14. The tow lot was 20 minutes east. If he started the truck now and drove without stopping, he would arrive with time to spare, and Curtis would hand him a work shirt and a bottle of water, and he would spend 3 days doing the thing he was good at. The thing that still made sense. The mechanical work of engines and metal and problems that had solutions you could hold in your hands. He put his hand on the ignition key. Smoky was not looking at him. She was looking through the passenger window at the clapboard house. Her ears were forward, rotated slightly. The left one tracking the house and the right one scanning the road. A split attention posture that Jax had seen 1,000 times in environments where the threat picture was ambiguous and the correct response had not yet been determined. Her body was still, but her stillness was not relaxed. It was the loaded stillness of an animal in assessment, processing data points that no human sensory system was equipped to detect, and the data she was processing was not coming from the house or the road or the paper on the door. It was coming from the woman inside. Smoky's nose worked once, a single deliberate intake that flared her nostrils and then settled. She turned her head and looked at Jax. The amber eyes were level and clear, and they held no instruction and no judgment and no appeal. They held only the fact of her attention, which was the same attention she had given him before every mission, in every vehicle, in every staging area where the next order had not yet come, and the space between waiting and acting was a space only the two of them occupied. She turned back to the window. Then she moved. It was not dramatic. She did not lunge or whine or paw at the door. She simply shifted her weight forward on the bench seat, repositioning her front paws so that they were beneath her chest rather than extended, a posture that Jax recognized instantly because it was the posture she assumed when she was preparing to exit a vehicle. Ready position, awaiting the door. She had decided before he had. He sat with his hand on the key for 11 seconds. He knew it was 11 seconds because he counted them the way he counted everything, automatically, without deciding to each number falling into the continuous thread of his count, like a heartbeat he could not stop. He thought about $180. He thought about Curtis, who was fair and who could not hold the slot and who would give it to someone else by 8:15 without anger or apology, because that was how work operated at the margins where Jax lived. He thought about $34 and a dead fan, and the math that did not work out, and the specific suffocating weight of choosing someone else's emergency over his own survival when his own survival was not, by any honest measure, currently succeeding. And he thought about the woman in the house dress who had stood in her own doorway and looked at a piece of paper that was going to take her home and had not touched it because touching it made it real, and he recognized that gesture with a precision that went deeper than empathy, deeper than sympathy, deeper than any word the English language had constructed to describe the experience of watching another human being stand at the exact coordinate on the map where the system meets the individual, and the individual does not have the vocabulary to fight back. He took his hand off the key. He reached across Smoky and opened the passenger door. The heat came in like a wall, immediate and total, pressing against his face and arms and chest with the physical authority of something that intended to be taken seriously. Smoky dropped from the cab to the ground with the controlled, precise movement of an animal that had exited vehicles under conditions significantly less forgiving than a Mississippi morning. And she stood on the gravel shoulder and waited, facing the road, facing the house, her tail low and still, her weight evenly distributed across all four legs in the stance of a dog that was not on alert and was not at rest, but was simply present and ready for whatever came next. Jax stepped out after her. He closed the door. He did not lock the truck because there was nothing in the truck worth stealing that was not already in the bag on his shoulder or standing beside him on four legs. He looked at the house across the road. The paper on the door was a white rectangle in the shade of the porch, bright against the dark wood, visible and specific and wrong in a way that no one in that house and no one who had taped it there understood. But he understood. That was the problem. He understood, and understanding was a debt that his particular wiring would not allow him to leave unpaid, and he had $34 and a dog who had already decided, and a 4-hour window that was now 3 hours and 46 minutes. And the work at Curtis's lot was already a ghost, already gone. Already part of the arithmetic that would come out negative again tonight. He crossed the road. The yard was neat. That was the first thing Jax registered as he stepped across the shallow drainage ditch and onto the packed dirt path that led from the road to the front gate, and it mattered because neatness, in Jax's experience, was a form of communication. A yard that was neat in this heat, in this economy, in a town where half the houses on this road had porches that sagged and gutters that hung loose and lawns that had surrendered to the crabgrass and the red clay months ago. A yard that was still neat was a yard maintained by someone who had not yet given up. The grass was cut short and even. The edges along the path were trimmed. A row of crepe myrtles along the south side of the house had been pruned recently, their branches cut at the correct angle, not hacked, and the cuttings had been raked and removed. There were 2 metal chairs on the porch, the old-fashioned kind with the scalloped backs, painted white, and between them a small table that held a glass jar with a faded plastic flower in it, and the jar had water in it, which meant someone had filled it recently, which meant someone still believed the porch was a place where a person might sit. The gate was a low chain-link affair, waist-high, with a latch that did not lock. Jax stopped at the gate. He did not open it. He did not reach for it. He stood on the public side of the property line with his hands visible at his sides and Smoky sitting at his left heel in a down position that she had assumed without a command, her body relaxed, and her eyes forward, and her bearing the specific combination of calm and attention that she carried when the situation required trust to be established before anything else could happen. Jax understood what this looked like. A white man in a worn military surplus jacket, with a fraying collar and scarred hands, and a dark beard that needed trimming, standing at the gate of a black woman's house in rural Mississippi, with a large German shepherd at his side. He understood the history that preceded him to this gate, the centuries of history that lived in the specific geography between a white stranger and a black woman's front door in the Delta. And he understood that his intentions were irrelevant until the woman inside decided they were relevant. And that decision was hers alone, and he would stand at this gate in the 108-degree heat until she made it or until the 4-hour window closed, whichever came first. He waited. The screen door opened 3 inches. He could see a slice of the interior, A dark hallway, a wall with framed photographs, the edge of a table. He could not see the woman, but he knew she was there because Smoky's ears adjusted, both rotating forward by a fraction, tracking a sound source that was standing just inside the door and assessing him with the same deliberate, unhurried evaluation that he was offering her. "I don't need anything." The voice came through the screen, clear and firm and carrying the specific cadence of a woman who had been saying that sentence to strangers for long enough that it had become less a statement than a fortification. "Thank you, but I don't need anything." "No, ma'am," Jax said. He did not raise his voice, and he did not lower it. He spoke at the volume of a man having a conversation across a reasonable distance with a person he intended to respect. "I'm parked across the road. I saw the deputy this morning." A pause. The screen door did not move. "I saw the notice he put on your door," Jax said. "I can read the document from here." This was not entirely true. He had read the format from across the road, but he had photographed the notice on his phone while crossing the yard, a quick image captured without breaking stride, and he had looked at the photograph while standing at the gate. And what he had seen in those 6 seconds of reading had confirmed what the format had already told him. "There's an error on the filing. The creditor listed on the eviction notice does not match the lien holder on the property record. The chain of title is broken." Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but is instead so full of calculation and experience and the specific exhaustion of being a person who has been lied to by helpful strangers that it has a weight and a texture that presses against the air between two people like a third presence in the conversation. "Who are you?" the woman said. It was not inflected as a question. It was inflected as a demand for information that would determine whether the next thing that happened was the door opening or the door closing. "My name is Jax Harlan. I'm a veteran. I've been parked across the road for 11 days, he said it flat, without embellishment, the way he had learned to deliver situation reports in rooms where accuracy was more important than comfort. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not from any organization. I learned to read legal documents because someone used them against me, and I didn't want that to happen twice." Another pause. Longer this time. Jax could hear the cicadas beginning their daytime cycle in the pecan trees behind him, a lighter sound than their nighttime chorus, intermittent rather than continuous, like a system running diagnostics. He could hear his own breathing and Smoky's breathing, slightly faster than his, and he could hear, from inside the house, the small mechanical sounds of a home that was being lived in, the hum of a refrigerator, the tick of a clock, the creak of a floorboard as the woman shifted her weight behind the screen door. The door opened another 4 inches. He could see her now. She was standing with one hand on the doorframe and the other holding a pair of reading glasses that she had not yet put on, and her face, in the shadow of the hallway, carried an expression that Jax recognized because he had worn it himself more times than he could count. It was the expression of a person performing a risk assessment with inadequate information, weighing the cost of trust against the cost of another door closed in another face, running an equation that had no clean answer and a deadline that did not care about the difficulty of the math. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Smoky. She looked at Smoky the way Jax had seen only a handful of people in his life look at a dog, with an attention that was not casual and not sentimental, but was instead rooted in a specific kind of knowledge. She was looking at Smoky the way a person who had grown up around working dogs looked at a working dog, reading the posture and the bearing and the set of the ears and the position of the weight across the legs, reading the animal the way Jax read legal documents, with a literacy that had been earned rather than taught. Her eyes moved across Smoky's body and stopped at the left flank, the scar. It ran from just behind the rib cage to the top of the hip, a ridge of pale tissue visible beneath the thinned fur, the permanent signature of the IED that had ended Smoky's military career on a road outside of Kandahar that did not have a name on any map that Jax had ever been given. The scar was not hidden. Smoky wore it the way she wore everything, with the complete absence of self-consciousness that was one of the many things about her that Jax envied and could not replicate. The woman studied the scar for a long time. Then she looked at the way Smoky was sitting, not alert, not tense, not straining against an invisible leash or scanning the environment for threats, just sitting, present, patient. Her amber eyes steady and forward, her breathing even, her body communicating the single unambiguous message that a military working dog communicates when the threat assessment has been completed and the result is 0. Safe, this space is safe. The person at this gate is not a danger. "That dog been to war," the woman said. It was not a question. It was a recognition, one veteran's family looking at another veteran's body and reading the map of what it had cost. "Yes, ma'am," Jax said. "We both did." The screen door opened. "Not all the way, but enough." "My name is Aurelia Thibodeau," the woman said. "Miss Aurelia, come up on the porch out of that sun before you fall out. I won't have that on my conscience." The interior of the house was dark and 10 degrees cooler than the porch, and it smelled the way houses smell when they have been continuously inhabited by the same person for more than 5 decades. Layered, specific, irreducible. Lemon oil furniture polish and cedar and the faint sweetness of something baked recently, and the deeper, older smell of wood and dust and time, the particular olfactory signature of a life that had been conducted entirely within these walls and had soaked into every surface until the house and the woman were no longer separate entities but expressions of the same long, continuous sentence. The photographs on the hallway wall told the story before Miss Aurelia said a word. Jax saw them as he followed her through the narrow corridor to the kitchen at the back of the house, and he read them the way he read everything. Quickly, cataloging details, constructing a timeline from the visual evidence. A young couple in front of this house, the paint fresh, the magnolia tree half its current size. A man in a Marine Corps dress uniform, the photograph tinted with the specific color palette of the late 1960s. The same man older, standing beside a teenage boy in a football jersey. A woman, Miss Aurelia, 30 years younger, holding a baby on the porch in one of the white metal chairs. Grandchildren in school portraits, their faces tracking the decades through hairstyles and clothing and the changing quality of photographic paper. A funeral program in a small frame, the kind of frame you buy at a drugstore, with a cross on the cover and a date that Jax calculated to be 11 years ago. She had buried her husband from this house. She had raised grandchildren in this house. She had been inside these walls since 1971, which meant she had been here for the moonwalk and Watergate, and the fall of Saigon, and every president, and every war, and every flood season, and every August when the heat did what the heat was doing now, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. The kitchen had a table with a cloth on it, and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a backyard, where a vegetable garden was still producing despite the heat. The tomato plants staked and tied with strips of cloth, the okra standing tall and green against the fence. Miss Aurelia gestured to a chair. Jax sat. Smoky positioned herself beside his leg, her body against his calf, and settled with the quiet efficiency of a dog that had learned to occupy minimal space in unfamiliar environments without drawing attention. Miss Aurelia placed a glass of water in front of him without asking if he wanted it. She placed a bowl of water on the floor beside Smoky without asking about that either. Then she sat across from him and placed a manila folder on the table between them, thick with papers, the edges worn soft from handling, and she opened it with the careful, practiced motions of a woman who had opened this folder many times in front of many people and had been told many times that there was nothing to be done. "I've been trying to tell someone about this for 8 months, she said. Jax opened the folder. He read. It took him 20 minutes to go through the documents, and in those 20 minutes, Miss Aurelia did not speak, and Jax did not speak, and the only sounds in the kitchen were the hum of the refrigerator, and the ticking of the clock, and the slow, steady rhythm of Smoky's breathing, and the occasional rustle of paper as Jax turned a page and placed it face down on the table and picked up the next one. He read the way he had taught himself to read legal documents in that law library in Virginia, with a pencil in his hand and a method that was borrowed directly from his military training. Identify the objective, identify the terrain, identify the obstacles, identify the route. The objective was the house, the terrain was the paperwork. The obstacles were the names. The names were the problem. The original mortgage had been issued in 1971 by a regional bank that no longer existed. That bank had been acquired in 1989 by a larger bank that had been acquired in 2004 by a holding company that had sold its mortgage portfolio in 2008 to a servicing company that had gone bankrupt in 2011. Somewhere in that chain, the loan had been marked as active when it should have been marked as satisfied. Miss Aurelia's son, the Marine in the photograph on the wall, had taken out a second loan against the house in 1998 to pay for repairs after a flood, and he had paid that loan in full in 2003. And the satisfaction of that debt should have cleared the title entirely, but it had. The satisfaction had been filed with the wrong county office, or it had been filed correctly and then lost, or it had been filed and then deliberately overlooked by the company that purchased the servicing rights in 2012, a company called Delta Southern Capital Group. which was the name on the eviction notice taped to the front door. Delta Southern Capital Group had purchased what it claimed was an outstanding debt of $14,000. It had added fees, penalties, and interest for 7 years without notification. The amount it now claimed Miss Aurelia owed was $41,000. The eviction had been filed when she did not respond to a notice she said she never received, sent to an address that was this address, but with an incorrect zip code, a discrepancy that was either a clerical error or something worse than a clerical error, and Jax, sitting in Miss Aurelia's kitchen reading the paperwork with the pencil moving line by line across each page, was not prepared to decide which one it was. Not yet. What he was prepared to decide was that the chain of title was broken. The creditor on the eviction notice was Delta Southern Capital Group, the lien holder on the most recent property record, which Miss Aurelia had obtained from the county assessor's office 4 months ago and which was the most current document in the folder, listed the lien holder as Gulf Region Mortgage Services, which was the company that had gone bankrupt in 2011. Delta Southern claimed to have purchased the debt from Gulf Region, but the assignment of mortgage, which should have been filed with the county recorder's office documenting the transfer, was not in the folder. Jax asked Miss Aurelia if she had ever seen such a document. She had not. He asked if anyone at the county recorder's office had mentioned it. They had not. Without the assignment of mortgage, Delta Southern Capital Group could not legally prove it owned the debt. Without proof of ownership, the eviction was built on a foundation that did not exist. The filing was not merely flawed, it was potentially void. Jax closed the folder. He looked at the clock on Miss Aurelia's kitchen wall. It was 7:51. The window to file a contest to the eviction closed at noon. The courthouse was 12 minutes away. Miss Aurelia, he said, I need to take this folder to the courthouse. I need to file a contest on your behalf before noon today. I am not a lawyer, and I cannot represent you, but I can file the paperwork, and I can show the clerk the specific error that makes this eviction challengeable. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Miss Aurelia looked at him across the table. She looked at the folder. She looked at Smoky, who had not moved from Jax's side, whose amber eyes were watching Miss Aurelia with the steady, unblinking attention of an animal that reads human beings the way weather stations read barometric pressure, measuring the invisible shifts in the atmosphere that precede the storm. I understand, Miss Aurelia said. I've understood for 8 months. I just couldn't get anybody else to understand. She paused. Her hand rested on the table beside the folder, her fingers spread, and the hand was shaking, not dramatically, not visibly from a distance, but from across a kitchen table, in the stillness of a house where 2 people and a dog were the only moving things. The tremor was unmistakable, and it was not a tremor of age. It was the tremor of a woman who had been carrying a weight alone for 8 months, and had just for the first time set part of it down on a surface that might hold. You're going to miss your work, she said. Jax looked at her. She had heard nothing about Curtis. She had heard nothing about the 3 days or the money or the math. She simply knew the way people who have lived at the margins know that when a man who is sleeping in his truck on the side of the road gets up and walks across that road to help you, the thing he is walking away from is the only thing he had. Yes, ma'am, Jax said. He picked up the folder. He stood. Smoky rose beside him with the smooth, synchronized motion of an animal that tracks the center of gravity of her handler, so precisely that the 2 of them move like components of a single system, standing and turning and orienting toward the door in a sequence that was neither commanded nor discussed but simply executed, the way breathing is executed, because the partnership had long ago passed the threshold where coordination required thought. They drove to the courthouse. Jax's truck pulled into the gravel lot at 8:03. The engine ticking in the heat. The air conditioner a memory of a feature that had stopped functioning 2 states ago. The courthouse sat on the main road at the center of town, a 2-story brick building with tall windows and a flagpole out front where an American flag hung limp in the windless air, the fabric so still it looked painted against the white sky. Jax took the folder and left the windows down for Smoky and walked through the front doors into a heat that was different from the outside heat. A heat that was trapped and stale and layered with the smell of old paper and floor wax and the specific institutional humidity of a building whose mechanical systems had been failing incrementally for years while the people inside adapted the way people adapt to all slow deteriorations by not noticing. The clerk's office was on the first floor through a hallway with linoleum tiles that had been waxed so many times the original color was indeterminate. And the woman behind the counter was efficient in the way of small-town government employees who process the same forms every week and have long ago stopped seeing the human consequences attached to each one. Jax placed the folder on the counter. He explained what he needed. He spoke in the flat, specific, jargon-free language of a man who has learned that bureaucratic systems respond to precision the way military systems respond to rank. He did not use legal terminology he was not certain of. He did not embellish. He did not argue. He stated the facts. The eviction notice listed Delta Southern Capital Group as the creditor. The most recent property record listed Gulf Region Mortgage Services as the lien holder. There was no assignment of mortgage on file documenting the transfer. Without that document, the eviction lacked standing. He was filing a contest on behalf of the homeowner under the applicable statutory provision, which he named because he had looked it up on his phone in Miss Aurelia's kitchen while she watched him with an expression he could not read and did not try to. The clerk looked at the folder. She looked at Jax. She asked if he was an attorney. He said he was not. She asked if he was a relative of the homeowner. He said he was not. She told him that a non-attorney non-relative could not file on behalf of a homeowner without a signed authorization. And she said this with the tone of a person delivering information that would, in her experience, end the conversation. Jax had anticipated this. He had written the authorization on a piece of notebook paper in Miss Aurelia's kitchen, and Miss Aurelia had signed it. It was not a legal form. It was a handwritten statement on lined paper that said, "I, Aurelia Thibodeau, authorize Jax Harlan to file a contest to eviction case number," and then the case number copied from the notice on the door, signed and dated. Jax placed it on the counter beside the folder. The clerk looked at the paper. She looked at Jax again. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not from hostility to warmth, but from the default position of institutional indifference to something slightly adjacent. The expression of a person who has just recognized that the man standing in front of her counter has done this before and knows the steps and is not going to go away. She took the folder. She began processing the filing. It was 8:27. Curtis was starting without him. Jax stood at the counter in the heat of the unair-conditioned courthouse and watched the clerk stamp each page with a date and a filing number. And each stamp landed with a sharp percussive sound that echoed in the tile hallway. And each echo entered his ears and traveled to a part of his brain that catalogs sounds by threat level. And the catalog opened a drawer and looked for a match. And the match was not there, but the drawer stayed open. And Jax stood very still and breathed and waited for the clerk to finish. The filing took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of standing at a counter in a building where the air did not move and the heat accumulated in layers, each minute adding another thin, transparent sheet of warmth to the atmosphere until the hallway felt less like a space inside a building and more like the interior of something organic. A throat or a lung, something that was breathing around him with a slow, wet, patient rhythm. The clerk processed the paperwork with the methodical pace of a woman who had learned that accuracy mattered more than speed and that the people standing in front of her counter would wait because they had no choice. And Jax waited because he had no choice. And the stamp came down on each page with the same sharp, percussive report. And each report entered his ears and traveled the same neural pathway to the same drawer in the same catalog. And each time the drawer opened and looked for a match. And each time the match was not quite there, but not quite absent either. Hovering in the space between recognition and memory, like a word on the tip of a tongue that the tongue does not want to find. He was aware of it. That was the first stage, awareness. A slight elevation in his baseline alertness that was not yet alarm but was no longer calm. A shift in the internal weather that he had learned to monitor the way a pilot monitors instruments, not because the readings were currently dangerous, but because the trajectory they described, if left uncorrected, led to airspace he could not afford to enter. His hands were on the counter. His fingers were flat against the laminate surface, spread slightly, pressing down with a pressure that would have been invisible to anyone watching but that Jax could feel in the tendons of his forearms, a deliberate grounding. A technique he had developed not from any therapist's manual or any VA pamphlet, but from the private solitary, trial-and-error experimentation of a man who had no one to teach him how to manage the thing inside his head, and had therefore taught himself through the only method available. Repetition, observation, and the systematic cataloging of what worked and what did not. Flat hands on a solid surface worked, sometimes. The clerk finished the filing at 9:08. She placed the stamped copies in the folder and slid the folder across the counter and told Jax that the contest had been received and that the homeowner would be notified of the hearing date by mail, and that if the homeowner wished to retain legal representation she should do so before the hearing. She said all of this in the same flat procedural tone she had used since the beginning, but at the end she paused and added, without looking up from her computer screen, that the legal aid office in Greenville sometimes took property cases and that their number was in the phone book. It was the smallest possible kindness. It was delivered with the smallest possible acknowledgement, and it was enough. Jax took the folder and turned from the counter and walked into the hallway, and the hallway was where it started. The fluorescent lights, he had been under them for 40 minutes without registering them as a separate stimulus because the filing had occupied the foreground of his attention, and the lights had been background, part of the environment, no more notable than the floor or the walls. But now, with the filing complete, and the folder in his hand, and no task between his mind and the building around him, the lights arrived. They were the long tube variety, recessed in ceiling panels that had yellowed with age, and they emitted a hum. Not the buzzing hum of a fixture with a failing ballast, which was an irregular, sputtering sound, but the steady, constant, low-frequency hum of a fluorescent tube operating at the exact electrical frequency it was designed to operate at, a frequency that was 60 cycles per second, which was the standard for alternating current in the United States, which was a fact that Jax knew because he had looked it up once at 3 in the morning in a public library in Tennessee, trying to understand why certain lights made him feel like the floor was tilting and other lights did not. 60 cycles per second produced a hum at 120 Hz due to the doubling effect of the magnetic ballast, and 120 Hz was a frequency that lived in a very specific neighborhood of the auditory spectrum, a neighborhood that was adjacent to, but not identical to, another frequency that had no name and no address but that occupied a room in Jax's memory that had no door he could close. The hallway extended 40 feet in front of him, linoleum floor, institutional walls painted the color of nothing, ceiling panels with the fluorescent tubes humming behind them, and at the far end a set of glass doors that opened onto the parking lot, where his truck was sitting in the sun with Smoky waiting inside with the windows down. 40 feet. He could walk 40 feet in approximately 15 seconds at a normal pace. He began walking. At 12 feet the hum changed. It did not actually change. The fixtures did not alter their frequency or their output or their operational parameters. What changed was the filter through which Jax's auditory system was processing the sound, a filter that had been set to background for 40 minutes and was now, in the absence of a task to occupy the foreground, recalibrating itself with the automatic, ruthless efficiency of a system that had been trained in environments where the difference between background sound and significant sound was measured in milliseconds and in lives. The hum came forward. It stepped out of the background and into the middle distance, and it stood there and it waited. At 20 feet, the hallway began to narrow. It did not actually narrow. The walls did not move. The ceiling did not lower. The linoleum did not contract. But the space between Jax and the walls on either side of him decreased in a way that was perceptual rather than physical, a compression of the visual field that he recognized from previous episodes as the first reliable indicator that the thing in the drawer had found a partial match and was now running a comparison algorithm that would, if not interrupted, complete its analysis and deliver its findings to the part of his brain that did not understand the difference between a courthouse hallway in Mississippi in 2024 and a corridor in a building in Fallujah in 2007 that had the same lights and the same hum and the same dead still air that tasted like dust and metal. His hands closed. The folder crumpled slightly in his right fist, and the sound of the paper crinkling was small and specific, and it was not the right sound. It was not a sound that matched anything in the catalog. And the wrongness of it, the specificity of its wrongness, gave him a handhold. He focused on the sound of the paper. He pressed the folder harder. The paper crinkled louder. He listened to it. He built a wall out of the sound. A thin wall. A paper wall between himself and the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the wall held for approximately 8 seconds. Then the stamp. Someone behind the counter in the clerk's office stamped a document. The sound traveled down the hallway, amplified by the hard surfaces and the linoleum and the absence of any other sound except the hum. And it arrived at Jax's ears with a clarity that was surgical, a clean, sharp report that could have been a rubber stamp on paper, or could have been a rubber stamp on paper, or could have been the sound that a breaching charge makes when the detonation is small and controlled, and you're on the correct side of the door and everything goes according to plan, and the only reason the sound lives in the catalog at all is because of the half-second of silence that follows it. The half-second before the room on the other side reveals what it contains. Jax stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the hallway at approximately the 24-foot mark. The glass doors were 16 feet in front of him. He could see the parking lot through the glass. He could see the front end of his truck. He could see, if he focused past the glare on the glass, the shape of Smoky in the passenger seat, her head up, her ears forward, oriented toward the building, toward him, as if she could see through the brick and the drywall and the fluorescent lit air and locate him by some sense that did not require line of sight. His breathing had changed. He was aware of this. His respiration rate had increased from its normal 12 breaths per minute to something faster. He did not count it. He did not want to count it, because counting his breathing would mean acknowledging that the count was necessary, and acknowledging that the count was necessary would mean admitting that he was not simply standing in a hallway, but was instead standing in 2 hallways simultaneously. One in Mississippi and one in a country he had left 7 years ago, but that had not, despite the distance and the years and the 7,000 miles of ocean and continent between here and there, left him. His hands gripped the folder. His knuckles were white. The tendons in his forearms stood out like cables, and the scars on his hands, thin white lines from mechanical work, and one wider, smoother scar across the back of the right hand, from a piece of shrapnel that had been too small for surgery and had worked its way out on its own over the course of 3 weeks in a forward operating base, where medical attention was allocated by severity, and a laceration that was not bleeding was not severe. The scars caught the fluorescent light, and for a single disorienting instant, the light on the scars looked like a different light on the same scars in a different corridor. And the drawer in the catalog slammed open, and the match was there. The match was not a complete memory. It was never a complete memory. It was a fragment, a sensory shard, a splinter of experience that had broken off from the larger event and embedded itself in the tissue of his nervous system with the permanence of shrapnel. The fragment was this: fluorescent light on a concrete floor, and the hum at 120 hertz, and the smell of dust, and the half-second of silence after a controlled detonation, and then, in the space where the next thing should have been, nothing. A gap. A white space in the recording where the tape had been erased or overwritten, or had simply given up trying to capture what happened next, and the white space was worse than any image it might have contained, because the white space was a space his mind filled with possibility, and possibility, in the architecture of trauma, was infinite and therefore infinitely terrible. He could not move forward. The glass doors were 16 feet away, and they might as well have been 16 miles. His legs were locked, not from paralysis but from the competing instructions of 2 operational systems running simultaneously on the same hardware. The system that said, walk forward, the truck is there, Smoky is there, the exit is right there, and the system that said, do not move, do not advance. The corridor has not been cleared, the half-second of silence is still running, and you do not know what is on the other side. A sound behind him. Footsteps, someone walking down the hallway from the opposite direction, the rubber soles of their shoes making soft rhythmic contact with the linoleum, and the sound was ordinary. Completely ordinary, the sound of a human being walking at a normal pace through a public building. And Jax catalogued it as ordinary, and dismissed it as ordinary, and then his body, operating on a system that did not consult his conscious assessment, pivoted 30 degrees to the right and pressed his shoulder against the wall, and his right hand released the folder and moved to his hip where there was nothing, where there had not been anything for 7 years, and the hand closed on air and held it. The person walked past, a woman in her 40s carrying a stack of files, her eyes on her phone, her trajectory a straight line from one end of the hallway to the other. She did not look at Jax. She did not see Jax. She walked past him the way people walk past furniture, and the footsteps receded, and the hallway was empty again, and Jax was standing with his shoulder against the wall, and his hand gripping nothing at his hip, and the folder on the floor at his feet, and the fluorescent lights humming at 120 hertz above his head. He counted. He did not choose to count. The count started itself, picking up from where it had left off, continuous and unbroken, the thread that connected each moment to the next and prevented the moments from scattering into the white space where they could be rewritten by the fragment. 4,847, 4,848. Each number was a breath. Each breath was a physical event that took place in the present tense, in this hallway, in this building, in Mississippi, in July, in a courthouse where he had just filed a piece of paper that might save a woman's house, and the numbers were evidence that the present tense existed and that he was in it. 4,849. The hum was still there. The hum would always be there. But the numbers were louder. Not actually louder. Louder in the hierarchy of his attention, climbing from background to foreground, displacing the hum not by overpowering it, but by providing an alternative focal point, a competing signal that his auditory cortex could lock onto the way a radio locks onto a frequency, not because the frequency is stronger, but because the receiver has been tuned to find it. 4,850. He felt Smoky before he saw her. A pressure against his left calf, firm and warm and steady, a contact that was not a nudge and not a lean but a placement, deliberate and precise. 65 pounds of trained animal pressing her flank against his leg, with the specific pressure that she had been trained to apply in exactly this situation, handler in distress, environment non-hostile, intervention required. She had come through the glass doors. Someone had opened them and she had come through. Or she had pushed them open herself, which she was capable of doing with doors that were not latched. And these doors were the kind that swung both ways on spring hinges. And she had pushed through them and come down the hallway and found him against the wall. And she had not barked, and she had not whined, and she had not placed her paws on his chest or licked his face or performed any of the dramatic, cinematic gestures that people who have never worked with military dogs imagine that military dogs perform. She had simply pressed her body against his leg and held it there. The pressure was a frequency. It operated on the same principle as the count, but through a different channel, a tactile channel, a signal that entered through the nerve endings in his calf and traveled up through his body and arrived at the part of his brain that was running the comparison algorithm and said, in a language that was older than words and more reliable than any language Jax had ever spoken or heard spoken, "You are here. You are here, and I am here, and the corridor is clear, and there is nothing on the other side of the silence except a parking lot in Mississippi, where the truck is waiting, and the heat is real, and the present tense is the only tense that exists." Jax breathed. His hand opened at his hip. His shoulder came off the wall. He looked down at Smoky, and Smoky looked up at him, and her amber eyes were the same amber eyes that had looked at him across the cargo bay of a Black Hawk helicopter in Afghanistan, and across the back seat of a Humvee in Iraq, and across every space they had shared in every country and every condition, and the eyes said nothing because they did not need to say anything. They were there. That was the message, the entire message. He picked up the folder. He straightened the pages that had crumpled in his grip. He walked the remaining 16 feet to the glass doors and pushed through them into the heat and the light and the parking lot where the truck sat baking in the sun with the windows down and the bench seat empty because its other occupant was beside him, pressed against his leg, walking stride for stride with the controlled, precise gait of a soldier who had completed her mission and was returning to base. They reached the truck. Jax opened the passenger door, and Smoky jumped in, and he closed the door, and walked around to the driver's side and sat behind the wheel, and put his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and gripped it and held it, and felt the heat of the vinyl under his palms. A heat that was real and present and located in a specific time and place. And he held the wheel until his hands stopped shaking. It took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, he sat in the truck in the courthouse parking lot in Mississippi in July, with the heat pressing against him from every direction, and Smoky sitting upright in the passenger seat with her ears forward and her eyes on the windshield, and her breathing slow and steady beside him. And he thought about standing up and walking across the parking lot and getting in the truck and driving east to the highway and taking the highway north and not stopping until this town and this courthouse and this woman's house and her folder full of paper and the fluorescent lights and the hum and the stamp and the half-second of silence were behind him. So far behind him that they became part of the landscape he was leaving rather than the landscape he was in. He could do that. He could drive. He had enough gas to reach the next town and the town after that. He could call Curtis and explain, and Curtis would understand or Curtis would not understand, but either way, the work would be there or it would not, and the math would come out the same way it always came out, and at least he would be moving, at least the wheels would be turning, at least the air would be coming through the windows, and the road would be unspooling in front of him, and the distance between himself and the fragment would be increasing with every mile, which was an illusion. He knew it was an illusion. The fragment traveled at the same speed he did because the fragment was inside him, but the illusion of distance was sometimes the only mercy available, and it was a mercy he had used before and could use again. He looked at the courthouse, the brick facade, the tall windows, the American flag hanging limp on the pole. He looked at the folder on the seat between him and Smoky. the manila paper soft with humidity, the stamped pages inside it representing a filing that was not yet a victory and was not yet a defeat but was only a beginning. A single document entered into a system that would process it at the system's own pace, with the system's own priorities, and the system did not care whether the man who filed it was sitting in the parking lot having a crisis or driving north at 70 miles an hour, trying to outrun a sound that had no source. From somewhere inside the building, muffled by the brick and the glass and the dead still air, he heard a woman's voice, not shouting, not raised in anger, just speaking at a normal volume. The way a person speaks when they are asking a question they have asked before and expecting the answer they have received before, the answer that is not an answer but a redirection, a procedural deflection, a pointing toward a door that leads to another door, that leads to another counter, where another person will redirect them again. He recognized the tone, not the voice, the tone. The specific musical shape of a sentence spoken by a person who is being patient because patience is the only weapon they have left, and they are running out of it, and they know they are running out of it. And the knowing is worse than the running out, because the knowing means they can hear themselves becoming the person the system is designed to make them become, quiet, compliant, and gone. He had used that tone. He had used it at the VA. He had used it at the courthouse in Virginia. He had used it in every room where a person behind a desk held the power to change his life and chose, through indifference or procedure or the simple mechanical fact that his file was one of 400 files on their desk that week, not. He took his hands off the steering wheel. The shaking had stopped. The fragment was still there, sitting in the open drawer of the catalog, but the drawer was no longer the only thing he could see. He could see the folder. He could see the parking lot. He could see the courthouse doors, and behind the doors, somewhere in the fluorescent-lit hallway where he had stood against the wall with his hand grasping air, there was a woman whose voice he had just heard, and she might be Miss Aurelia or she might not be, but she was using the tone. And the tone was a sound he knew better than the hum and better than the fragment and better than anything the catalog contained. He got out of the truck. He looked at Smoky. She was already looking at him. Her eyes were amber and steady, and they held the only question she ever asked, which was not a question at all but a statement of readiness. Where we go, I go. Come on, he said. His voice was rough. He had not spoken in 40 minutes. The words came out low and dry and stripped of everything except their function. He opened her door. She jumped down. They walked back across the parking lot toward the glass doors of the courthouse, man and dog. Stride for stride, moving forward because forward was the only direction either of them understood. And because somewhere inside that building a voice was using a tone that Jax Harlan could not hear and walk away from. Not today. Not with $34 in a filed contest, and a German shepherd who had already decided for both of them 11 days ago in a gravel turnout off Highway 1 that this mission was not optional. The voice belonged to Miss Aurelia. Jax found her on the second floor, in a room at the end of a hallway that was narrower than the one downstairs and hotter by several degrees. The heat rising through the building the way heat rises through all structures, accumulating at the top, pressing against the ceiling tiles with a patience that suggested it had been doing this for years and would continue doing this for years and did not require the cooperation or the comfort of the human beings who moved through it. The room was small. It might have been a hearing room once, or a records office, or simply a space that had been repurposed so many times that its original function had been sanded away by decades of rearranged furniture and reassigned nameplates until it was now simply a room with a table and 6 chairs and a window that did not open and a fluorescent fixture overhead that hummed at the same frequency as every other fluorescent fixture in the building. 120 hertz, constant and indifferent. Miss Aurelia was sitting on one side of the table. She was wearing the same pale blue house dress. Her manila folder was not in front of her because Jax had it, but she had brought other papers, a smaller collection, held together with a rubber band, and these were spread on the table in front of her in the careful, deliberate arrangement of a woman who has organized her evidence with the same care she gives to her yard and her vegetable garden and every other thing in her life that she maintains against the slow entropy of a world that is not paying attention. Across from her sat a man Jax had not seen before. He was perhaps 45, white, wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt with a company logo embroidered on the breast pocket that Jax could not read from the doorway. His hair was neatly combed. His posture was relaxed in the specific way that a person's posture is relaxed when they are in a room where they hold all the power, and know it, and have arranged their body to communicate that knowledge without saying a word. He had a leather portfolio open in front of him with printed documents organized behind tab dividers, and the portfolio and the dividers and the printed documents all communicated the same message. I am the professional in this room. My paperwork is in order. Yours is not. Beside the man against the far wall sat a younger woman with a laptop open on her knees. She was typing intermittently and not looking up. She was there to record. She was not there to participate. At the head of the table sat a county clerk. A different one from the woman downstairs, older, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a yellow legal pad in front of her, with notes that she was reviewing when Jax appeared in the doorway. This was not a hearing. It was too early for a hearing, and the contest had just been filed. This was something else, an informal meeting perhaps, a conversation arranged between the creditor and the homeowner that existed in the procedural gray space between a filing and a ruling, the kind of conversation that happens in small county courthouses where the docket is thin and the staff is small and the creditor's representative has driven 2 hours from Jackson and would prefer not to make the trip again. Jax stood in the doorway. Miss Aurelia saw him first. She did not speak, but her eyes moved to him and stayed, and in her expression he read something that was not relief and not hope, but was instead the specific recognition of a person who had expected to be alone in this room and was now, for reasons she could not fully explain, not alone. The man in the dress shirt turned in his chair and looked at Jax. The clerk looked up from her legal pad. "Can I help you?" the clerk said. "I filed a contest to eviction on behalf of Miss Aurelia this morning," Jax said. He held up the folder. "I have the stamped copies." The man in the dress shirt leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression did not change. He did not speak. He looked at Jax the way a person looks at an unexpected variable in an equation they had assumed was solved, with interest rather than concern, because the equation still favored him, and a single variable was unlikely to change that. "You're not an attorney," the man said. It was the same non-question format Miss Aurelia had used that morning. A statement dressed in the inflection of an inquiry. The man already knew the answer. "No, sir," Jax said. "Then I'm not sure what your role is here." The man returned his attention to the clerk. "We were discussing the outstanding balance and the homeowner's options for resolution prior to the hearing date." Jax looked at Miss Aurelia. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, her fingers laced together, and the tremor he had seen in her kitchen was there again. Not in her hands this time, but in the muscles at the corners of her mouth. A fine vibration that she was controlling through the application of the same force of will that kept her yard trimmed and her crepe myrtles pruned and her vegetable garden producing in 100-degree heat. She was holding herself together with the specific practiced precision of a woman who had been holding herself together for 8 months and was reaching the structural limit of what will alone could sustain. "Miss Aurelia," Jax said. "Would you like me to—" "Yes," she said. The word came out immediately, without hesitation, and it was the fastest she had spoken since he had met her, and the speed of it said more than the word itself. Jax entered the room. Smoky entered with him, her nails clicking softly on the tile floor, her body moving with the controlled, measured gait that she used in enclosed spaces, minimizing her footprint, keeping her mass close to Jax's legs, occupying the least amount of room possible while maintaining the maximum amount of awareness. Jax pulled a chair from the table and sat beside Miss Aurelia, not between her and the man in the dress shirt, but beside her, at her left, so that the man had to look at both of them or neither of them. Smoky settled on the floor at Jax's feet, her body aligned with his chair, her head up, her amber eyes moving once across every person in the room and then fixing on no one in particular and everyone in general. The panoramic, soft, focused vigilance of an animal that is not expecting a threat but is fully prepared to reclassify the situation at any moment. The man in the dress shirt introduced himself. His name was Keith Pryor. He was a field representative for Delta Southern Capital Group. He had driven from Jackson this morning to discuss the account with Miss Aurelia. He said the word account and not the word debt and not the word eviction, and the word choice was deliberate in the way that all of his word choices were deliberate, each one selected from a vocabulary designed to make the machinery of what was happening sound administrative rather than adversarial. Jax opened the folder. He placed the stamped contest on the table. He placed the property record beside it. And then he said, in the same flat, specific voice he had used with the clerk downstairs, that Delta Southern Capital Group had filed an eviction based on a debt it claimed to own, but for which no assignment of mortgage existed in the county records. He said that without that document, the chain of title was broken, and the creditor's standing was unestablished. He said that the original debt, a second mortgage taken by the homeowner's son, a Marine veteran, had been satisfied in full in 2003, and that the satisfaction document, while misfiled, existed and could be located. He said that the amount currently claimed, $41,000, had been manufactured through the compounding of fees and penalties applied to a debt that should not exist, against a property whose title should be clear. He said all of this without raising his voice, and without looking away from Keith Pryor's face, and without any of the emotional language that the situation might have warranted. Because Jax had learned, in every room like this he had ever occupied, that emotion was a resource the system used against you. The system wanted your anger. It wanted your tears. It wanted your frustration and your desperation and your raised voice, because each of those things was evidence that you had lost control of the conversation, and when you lost control of the conversation, the system won, not because it was right, but because it was patient and it had more chairs and more rooms and more time than you did. Keith Pryor listened. He did not interrupt. When Jax finished speaking, Pryor opened his leather portfolio to a tabbed section and removed a printed document and placed it on the table and turned it so the clerk could read it. "We have documentation of the debt transfer," he said. "The assignment was filed electronically in 2013 with the state registry. The county recorder's office may not have a physical copy on file, but the electronic filing is valid under Mississippi statute." He cited the statute number from memory, which told Jax that Pryor had used this exact argument in this exact kind of room many times before. Jax looked at the document. It was a printout of an electronic filing record, a single page with a transaction number and a date and the names of the transferring and receiving parties. It looked legitimate. It had the formatting and the reference numbers and the official language that legitimate documents have. But Jax had spent 3 weeks in a law library learning to distinguish between documents that were legitimate and documents that looked legitimate, and the distinction lived in details that were small enough to miss and large enough to matter. "The electronic filing shows a transfer from Gulf Region Mortgage Services to Delta Southern Capital Group," Jax said. "Gulf Region filed for bankruptcy in 2011. This transfer is dated 2013. A bankrupt entity cannot transfer assets outside of the bankruptcy proceeding. If this transfer was part of the bankruptcy estate sale, there would be a court order authorizing it. Do you have that court order?" Pryor's expression did not change, but his hand, which had been resting on the table beside his portfolio, moved. It moved slightly, a small adjustment, the kind of movement that a person makes when they are recalculating and do not want the recalculation to be visible. He did not answer the question immediately. He looked at the woman with the laptop. She had stopped typing. "The transfer was conducted through standard servicing channels," Pryor said. "The details of the original acquisition are proprietary. The details of the original acquisition determine whether your company legally owns this debt," Jax said. "If the transfer was not authorized by the bankruptcy court, Delta Southern has no standing. The eviction fails." The room was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. The clerk was writing on her legal pad. Pryor was looking at Jax with an expression that had shifted from the relaxed confidence of a man holding all the power to something tighter, something recalibrated, the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting to negotiate with a 75-year-old woman who had no representation and no understanding of the paperwork, and had instead found a man who could read every line of it and was not going to stop reading. But the room was also doing something else. The room was pressing on Miss Aurelia. Jax could see it. He could see it the way he saw everything in a room, through the peripheral awareness that never shut off, the constant scanning of the environment that registered changes in posture and breathing and the micro-movements that people make when the internal pressure exceeds the external composure. Miss Aurelia was sitting beside him with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her chin level, and she was from any distance greater than 3 feet composed. But from where Jax sat, close enough to see the individual threads of the cloth on her house dress and the texture of the skin on her hands and the pulse in the vein at her temple, she was not composed. She was enduring. She was enduring the way a structure endures a load that is approaching its maximum rating, still standing, still intact, but vibrating at a frequency that only someone very close could detect. Her hands were shaking again, both of them this time, laced together in her lap, the fingers pressing against each other with the force of a woman trying to hold herself still by holding herself together. And the shaking was not large, but it was continuous, and it was accelerating in the way that a small tremor accelerates when the force causing it does not relent. She had been telling people for 8 months. 8 months of folders and phone calls and trips to this courthouse and conversations with clerks and conversations with representatives and conversations with anyone who would listen, and no one had listened, not because they were cruel, but because the system was not designed to listen. The system was designed to process, and processing in the specific vocabulary of institutions that handle people's homes and debts and lives did not include the word listen. Pryor was speaking again. He was addressing the clerk, not Miss Aurelia, explaining the company's position with the smooth, practiced fluency of a man who had explained this position in 100 rooms, and his voice was calm and reasonable and professional, and it did not once, not for a single syllable, acknowledge that the person whose home he was attempting to take was sitting 4 feet away from him, with her hands shaking in her lap. Miss Aurelia's breathing changed. Jax heard it. A slight catch at the top of the inhale, a micro-hesitation that was not a sob and was not a gasp but was the sound a person's body makes when the air itself has become difficult, when the act of breathing has been complicated by the weight of everything the breath has to carry, and the weight, in this room, in this moment, was 8 months of being polite and being patient and being told that there was nothing to be done, and the weight was too much, and the breathing was the first thing to show it. Her voice, when she spoke, was thinner than it had been in her kitchen. The substance of it had been reduced, not by volume but by density. The way a wire is reduced when you draw it through a smaller and smaller die, still intact, still continuous, but losing mass with each pass until it can carry less and less current before it breaks. "I've been telling people," she said. She was not speaking to Pryor. She was not speaking to the clerk. She was speaking to the room, to the air, to the accumulated weight of 8 months of saying words that no one heard. "I've been telling people this isn't right. My son paid this off. He paid every payment. He was a Marine. He served his country, and he came home, and he bought me this house, and he paid it off. And it's paid off, and I've been telling people." Her voice did not break. It thinned. It thinned to the point where the words were still audible, but the force behind them was almost gone, and the almost was the part that hurt, because almost gone was not the same as gone. And the difference between almost gone and gone was the difference between a woman who was still fighting and a woman who was about to stop. And the room could feel it. Everyone in the room could feel it. The specific gravity of a person reaching the end of what they can carry alone. Smoky moved. She had been lying at Jax's feet for the entire conversation, her body aligned with his chair, her head resting on her front paws, her breathing slow and metered, her eyes at half-mast in what anyone unfamiliar with military working dogs would have interpreted as relaxation or disinterest or the simple lethargy of a dog in a warm room. But Smoky was not relaxed. Smoky had been doing what Smoky always did, what she had been trained to do, what her particular combination of genetics and conditioning and years of operational experience had made her incapable of not doing. She had been reading the room. She had been processing the data that the room produced, the shifts in breathing and heart rate and cortisol and adrenaline and the dozen other chemical and physiological signals that the human body broadcasts continuously, and that the human conscious mind is too slow and too distracted and too invested in its own narrative to detect, but that a German Shepherd's sensory system catalogs with the same passive, comprehensive efficiency as a radar array sweeping a sky. She had been reading Miss Aurelia since the moment they entered the room. She had registered the tremor in the hands. She had registered the change in breathing. She had registered the shift in the chemical composition of the air around the old woman, the specific molecular signature of distress that the human body releases through the skin and the breath, and that travels across a room at a concentration far below the threshold of human detection, but far above the threshold of a dog whose olfactory system contained 225 million scent receptors, each one capable of distinguishing individual molecules in concentrations measured in parts per trillion. Smoky had read all of this, she had processed all of this, and she had waited, because waiting was part of the training, because a military working dog does not act on the first signal or the second signal or the fifth signal, but waits for the pattern to complete, for the data to accumulate past the threshold where response is not merely appropriate but necessary, and the threshold had just been reached. She rose from the floor. The movement was smooth and unhurried. a single fluid transition from prone to standing that made no sound except the soft click of her nails on the tile and a whisper of fur against the chair leg as she passed. She did not look at Jax. She did not wait for a command. She had received no command because no command was needed, because the bond between handler and dog had long ago passed the point where commands were the primary mode of communication. And what operated in their place was something that behaviorists would call conditioned autonomy and that Jax would call, if he ever spoke about it, which he did not, trust. Smoky stepped away from Jax's chair. She moved around the end of the table. Her path was direct but not rushed. The controlled, purposeful movement of an animal that knows exactly where it is going and exactly why and is allocating precisely the amount of energy required to get there without excess and without hesitation. The clerk looked up from her legal pad. Pryor stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open, his eyes tracking the dog with the instinctive, involuntary attention that all humans give to a large animal in motion in an enclosed space. The woman with the laptop pulled her feet back under her chair. Smoky walked to Miss Aurelia's chair. She stopped beside it, on Miss Aurelia's right side, the side closest to the wall, the side farthest from the man across the table. She turned her body so that she was facing the same direction as Miss Aurelia, oriented toward the room, and she stood there for a single moment, her shoulder level with the arm of the chair, her amber eyes passing once across the room and finding nothing that required further assessment. And then she did the thing that she had come to do. She lowered her head slowly, with a control and a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial in its precision. She brought her muzzle down and forward and placed it on Miss Aurelia's forearm, the right forearm, the one that was connected to the hand that was shaking in her lap. She placed her muzzle on the forearm and she let the weight of her head settle, not all at once but gradually, the way a hand settles on a shoulder, when the person placing it understands that the shoulder has been carrying something heavy and that the addition of even a small new weight must be done with care. The weight of Smoky's head was approximately 8 pounds. It rested on Miss Aurelia's forearm with a warmth that came from the deep layer of the double coat. The undercoat that insulated her in winter and in summer radiated a steady animal heat that was different from the heat of the room, that was alive in a way the room's heat was not, a warmth that pulsed with the slow rhythm of Smoky's heartbeat and that transferred through the fur and through the fabric of the house dress and into the skin and the muscle and the bone of a forearm that had been trembling for minutes and had been trembling in one way or another for 8 months. Miss Aurelia went still, not frozen, not startled, still. The way water goes still when the wind stops, the surface tension reasserting itself, the disturbance settling not because the force has been resolved, but because a counterforce has been applied, equal and opposite, and the two forces have reached a temporary equilibrium that allows the surface to hold. She looked down. Smoky's muzzle was resting on her arm, the black nose slightly past the edge of her wrist, the amber eyes looking up at her, with an expression that was not pleading and not sympathetic and not any of the anthropomorphized emotions that people project onto animals when they need the animals to be something the animals are not. The expression in Smoky's eyes was presence, unqualified, undemanding, complete presence. The same presence she had offered Jax on 1,000 nights in 1,000 dark places, when the fragment was running and the count was not enough. And the only thing that tethered him to the present tense was 65 pounds of German Shepherd pressed against his body with a certainty that did not require explanation because it predated language and would outlast it. Miss Aurelia's free hand, her left hand, rose from her lap. It rose slowly, as if the air in the room had thickened and movement through it required effort. And it traveled the short distance from her lap to Smoky's head and came to rest on the broad, flat plane of the skull between the ears. Her fingers settled into the fur. The fur was thick and warm, and it yielded slightly under the pressure of her fingertips, and the yielding was an invitation, and the invitation was accepted, and Miss Aurelia's fingers curled gently into the coat and held. The trembling stopped. It did not fade. It did not diminish gradually. It stopped, the way a sound stops when the source is removed, completely and without transition, and the stopping was so sudden and so total that it was itself a sound. A silence that entered the room and displaced the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scratch of the clerk's pen and the ambient noise of the building and replaced all of it with something that had no frequency and no wavelength and no name, but that every person in the room could feel. Pryor had stopped talking. He was looking at the dog and the old woman, and the place where the dog's head rested on the old woman's arm, and his expression had changed again, not dramatically, not from hostility to compassion, but from the professional confidence of a man executing a procedure to something less certain. Something that looked, if you were reading it closely, if you were reading it the way Jax read every expression in every room he entered, like the face of a man who had just been reminded that the numbers in his portfolio were attached to a human being, and that the human being was sitting 4 feet away from him with a dog's head on her arm and her fingers in the dog's fur, and a stillness that had not been there 60 seconds ago, and that his entire presentation had not been able to displace, but that the dog had, in the space of a single gesture, provided. The clerk had stopped writing. The room held. And then Miss Aurelia spoke. She spoke with her hand still in Smoky's fur, and her eyes still on Smoky's face, and the trembling still absent from her hands, and her voice, when it came, was not thin. It was not reduced. It was the voice she had used when she opened the screen door and told Jax her name, the voice of a woman who had maintained a house and a yard and a life for 53 years in the Mississippi Delta, and had not once, in all those years, stopped maintaining. "My son's name was Robert Thibodeau," she said. She was looking at Pryor now. He was a United States Marine. He served in Vietnam. He came home and he worked at the paper mill in Greenville for 31 years, and he bought me this house with his own money, and he paid every payment on time for 19 years, and he paid it off in 2003, and he kept the receipt in a frame on his wall because it was the proudest thing he ever did besides his service and his children. She paused. Smoky's tail moved once, a single slow sweep against the tile floor, the sound barely audible, a metronome marking a beat that only she and the woman in the chair could hear. "Robert died in 2018, Miss Aurelia said. Lung cancer from the chemicals. They gave him a flag. I have the flag in the living room in a case his granddaughter bought. And I have his house. That is what I have of my son, the flag in the house. And you are sitting in this room telling me he owes money on a house he paid for 20 years ago, and I am telling you he does not, and I have been telling people he does not for 8 months, and nobody has looked at the papers." She placed her hand flat on the table beside Smoky's head, her fingers spread steady now, the tremor gone, the surface holding. "This man looked at the papers," she said, and she did not gesture toward Jax, but everyone in the room knew who she meant. "And that dog knew I was hurting before anybody in this room knew I was hurting, so I'm asking you to look at the papers. That is all I have ever been asking." The clerk picked up her pen. She looked at Pryor. The look was brief, and it carried no instruction and no judgment, but it carried a question, and the question was the kind of question that does not need to be spoken in order to be heard. The kind of question that a person asks when they have been doing their job long enough to recognize the difference between a proceeding that is going to continue and a proceeding that has just changed direction. Pryor closed his portfolio. He did not close it with force or with anger. He closed it the way a man closes something he is going to reopen later, in a different room, after he has consulted with people who are not in this room. He looked at Miss Aurelia. He looked at Smoky, whose head still rested on the old woman's arm, whose amber eyes were still looking up with the same expression of unqualified presence, and something in his posture shifted, not collapsed, not surrendered, but adjusted, the way a structure adjusts when a new load has been added and the distribution of weight has changed. "We'll review the documentation," he said. "I'll be in contact with the county office." He stood. The woman with the laptop closed it and stood with him. They left the room. The sound of their footsteps in the hallway diminished and disappeared, and the room was quiet. Miss Aurelia did not move her hand from Smoky's head. She sat in the chair in the small room on the second floor of the courthouse with the fluorescent lights humming above her and the heat pressing against the windows and the stamped copies of the contest on the table in front of her and a German shepherd's muzzle on her arm, and she breathed, slowly and deeply, the way a person breathes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally been given permission to stop. Jax watched her. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. He watched the way her fingers moved in Smoky's fur, a slow rhythmic stroking that was not petting in the way that civilians pet dogs, casually and without attention, but was instead the focused, deliberate contact of a person who understood that the animal beneath her hand was not a comfort but a witness, and that being witnessed after 8 months of speaking into rooms that did not hear her was the thing she had needed more than she had known. She looked at Jax. Her eyes were wet, but nothing fell. She held it the way she held everything, with a dignity that was structural, built into the framework, load-bearing. "Your dog," she said. "Smoky," Jax said. "Smoky?" Miss Aurelia said the name the way she had said her son's name, with a weight that was not heavy but was specific, a weight that acknowledged that the name belonged to a being who had earned it. "She knows things." "Yes, ma'am," Jax said. "She does." Miss Aurelia nodded. She looked down at Smoky, and Smoky looked up at her, and the two of them held each other's gaze in the quiet room in the hot building in the small town in the Delta. And what passed between them was not language, and was not sentiment, and was not any of the things that people say about dogs when they want to make dogs smaller than they are. What passed between them was recognition. One being who had endured, looking at another being who had endured, and finding in the looking a confirmation that the enduring had not been invisible, had not been wasted, had not gone unwitnessed. Smoky's tail thumped once against the tile floor. The sound was soft and specific, and it was the only sound in the room, and it was enough. They sat in the room for several minutes after Pryor left. The clerk excused herself to process the filing downstairs, and the door closed behind her with a soft click, and the room became the quietest space Jax had occupied in weeks. Quieter even than the truck at night, because the truck at night had the cicadas and the highway and the ambient noise of an open landscape. And this room had only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the breathing of 3 living things in the distant, muffled sounds of a courthouse that was continuing to function on the floors below them, without any awareness that something had shifted in the small room on the 2nd floor. Miss Aurelia had not removed her hand from Smoky's head. Smoky had not moved her muzzle from Miss Aurelia's arm. The two of them had settled into a configuration that looked from the outside like a woman resting her hand on a dog. But that was from the inside, from where Jax sat close enough to see the specific pressure of Miss Aurelia's fingers in the fur and the specific angle of Smoky's ears, rotated slightly back, the position she held when she was monitoring a person's emotional state at close range, something more structured than rest. It was a watch. Smoky was standing watch over a woman she had met 2 hours ago with the same attentiveness she had once given to a handler she had known for years, and the transfer of that attention, the ease and the completeness of it, told Jax something about Miss Aurelia that no amount of conversation could have told him. Smoky did not give her attention to people who did not need it, and she did not give it to people who could not receive it. Miss Aurelia needed it and was receiving it, and that combination, in Smoky's operational calculus, was sufficient. Jax looked at the table. Pryor's printed document was still there. The electronic filing record, the single page that was supposed to prove Delta Southern's ownership of the debt. Pryor had left it, deliberately or carelessly, and it sat on the table between the stamped contest copies and Miss Aurelia's rubber-banded papers like a piece of unexploded ordnance, present and inert, and potentially dangerous depending on what you knew about its construction. Jax picked it up. He read it again. The transaction number, the date, March 14th, 2013, the transferring party, Gulf Region Mortgage Services. The receiving party, Delta Southern Capital Group. He had already identified the problem with the date. Gulf Region had filed for bankruptcy in 2011. A bankrupt entity could not transfer assets outside of the bankruptcy proceeding. This was not a technicality. This was a structural flaw in the claim, and Pryor's response, that the transfer had been conducted through standard servicing channels and that the details were proprietary, was not an answer. It was a door closing over a room he did not want opened. But there was something else on the document that Jax had not focused on during the meeting, because the meeting had been moving, and Miss Aurelia had been trembling, and the priority had been the immediate challenge, not the deeper architecture. Now, in the quiet room with the immediate challenge paused, the deeper architecture became visible. The company name, Delta Southern Capital Group. Jax had been reading it as a name the way you read any company name, as a label rather than a piece of information, but names in the specific world of financial entities that buy and sell debt were not merely labels. Names were skins. Names were the outermost layer of structures that shed their surfaces and grew new ones the way certain reptiles shed their scales, not because the underlying animal had changed, but because the old skin had become inconvenient. He took out his phone. The battery was at 19%. He had not charged it because charging it required running the truck's engine, and running the truck's engine required gas, and gas required money, and money required the work he had given up this morning. 19% was enough for what he needed, if he was efficient about it, and Jax was always efficient about it, the way he was efficient about everything. Not because efficiency was a virtue he had chosen, but because it was the only mode of operation available to a man whose resources were so constrained that waste of any kind, even the waste of a single percentage point of battery life, could cascade into a failure he could not afford. He searched for Delta Southern Capital Group. The results were sparse: a registered business entity in Mississippi, an address in Jackson, a website that consisted of a single page with a phone number and a generic description of services, no leadership names, no history, no reviews. The kind of digital presence that exists not to inform, but to satisfy the minimum requirements of existence. A placeholder that proves the entity is real without revealing anything about what it actually is. He refined the search. He added the term predatory lending. The results shifted. The first relevant result was an article from a legal advocacy website, dated 2019, that described a lawsuit filed against a company called Southern Regional Lending Partners. The lawsuit alleged that Southern Regional had systematically targeted vulnerable homeowners, including elderly people and veterans, with predatory loan products that carried hidden fee structures designed to manufacture debt from paid or nearly paid mortgages. The company had been sued by the state attorney general's office. It had paid a fine. It had agreed to a consent decree. It had changed its name. Jax read the article with the specific line-by-line attention that he applied to all documents that contained information capable of rearranging what he understood about a situation. He read it once, he read it again, he looked at the date of the consent decree. He looked at the date of Delta Southern Capital Group's registration as a business entity in Mississippi. The consent decree was dated November 2012. Delta Southern was registered in January 2013. The address listed for Southern Regional Lending Partners in the lawsuit was the same address listed for Delta Southern Capital Group on the website. The same address, the same building. Jax checked twice because the implication of what he was reading was significant enough to require the discipline of verification, and both times the numbers matched. Delta Southern Capital Group was Southern Regional Lending Partners. It was the same company, the same operation, the same machinery, wearing a new name the way a man on the run wears a new hat. It had been sued for doing exactly what it was doing to Miss Aurelia. It had paid a fine that was, relative to the revenue it generated, negligible. It had signed a piece of paper promising to stop. It had changed the name on its door and continued. He set the phone down. He looked at the document Pryor had left on the table, the electronic filing that claimed a 2013 transfer from a company that had been bankrupt since 2011. The document was not merely flawed. It was a fabrication produced by an entity that had been legally ordered to stop producing exactly this kind of fabrication and had responded by changing its name and continuing. Jax looked at Miss Aurelia. She was watching him. She had been watching him read his phone with the patient attention of a woman who has learned that when someone is reading on her behalf, the best thing she can do is be quiet and let them read. "Miss Aurelia," he said, "your son, Robert, when he took out the loan on the house, do you remember the name of the company?" She thought about it. The thinking was visible, a turning inward, a retrieval from a filing system that was organized not by date or by category, but by the associations that a life builds over decades, each memory connected to others by threads of sensation and image, and the specific emotional weather of the moment it was formed. "It was a long time ago," she said. 1998. Robert handled it. He came to me and said, "Mama, I'm going to fix the house up right," and he went to a company in Greenville. I don't remember the exact name, something with Southern in it. He said they were good people. They gave him a good rate because he was a veteran. Because he was a veteran. The words landed in the room with a weight that was physical, that Jax could feel in his chest the way he felt changes in barometric pressure, a tightening, a compression, a shift in the internal atmosphere that preceded something he could not yet name but could feel approaching with the slow, certain momentum of a weather system moving across a flat landscape. Because he was a veteran. The company had given Robert Thibodeau a good rate because he was a veteran. The same company, or the company that would become the same company after 2 name changes and a lawsuit, had targeted veterans with loan products designed to trap them. Robert Thibodeau, United States Marine, Vietnam veteran, 31 years at the paper mill, every payment on time, the receipt framed on his wall, had walked into an office in Greenville in 1998 and had been handled by people who saw his service not as something to honor but as something to exploit. A vulnerability dressed in a uniform, a man whose trust in institutions, earned through military service, made him the perfect customer for an institution designed to abuse that trust. And now, Robert Tybadock was dead from lung cancer, caused by chemicals he had been exposed to in the service that had made him a target, and the company that had targeted him had been sued and fined and renamed, and it was still operating, and it was trying to take his mother's house, the house he had bought her, the house he had paid off, the house where his funeral program hung in a drugstore frame on the hallway wall. Jax put both hands flat on the table. He pressed down. The laminate surface was warm and smooth and solid, and he pressed against it the way he pressed against every surface that grounded him, deliberately and with focus, because the thing he was feeling was not a PTSD trigger, and was not a flashback, and was not the fragment running its comparison algorithm in the catalog. The thing he was feeling was simpler and older and more dangerous than any of those things. The thing he was feeling was anger. He did not do anger well. He had never done anger well. Anger, for Jax, was not the hot, expressive, combustible emotion that civilians seemed to experience and release and move past like a summer storm. Anger, for Jax, was cold and structural, and it lived in the same deep architecture as the discipline and the precision and the operational focus that the Army had built into him over 12 years, and when it activated, it did not explode, it organized, it became a mission. And missions, once accepted, were executed with the same quiet, methodical, complete attention that he brought to everything. And the completion of the mission was not optional, and the cost of the mission was not a factor in the decision to execute it because the decision had already been made. It had been made in the moment the anger organized itself into a structure, and the structure was now bearing weight, and the weight was the specific, clarified, irreducible understanding that the machine that was trying to take Miss Aurelia's house was the same machine that had been grinding veterans and their families for decades, and the machine did not stop because it was fined, and the machine did not stop because it was sued, and the machine would not stop until someone climbed inside it and removed the part that made it run. He picked up his phone. 12%. He searched for legal aid organizations in the Mississippi Delta that handled predatory lending cases. He found 3. The first 2 had answering machines. The third was a nonprofit called the Delta Fair Housing Project. A woman answered. Jax told her his name. He told her he was calling from the county courthouse. He told her he had filed a contest to an eviction on behalf of a homeowner and that the creditor was Delta Southern Capital Group. He said the name and he waited. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for a phone silence. It was long enough that Jax checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then the woman spoke. "Say that name again," she said. "Delta Southern Capital Group," Jax said. "Where are you right now?" "County Courthouse." "Don't leave. I need to make a call. Can I reach you at this number?" "Yes, ma'am." She hung up. Jax looked at his phone. 11%. He set it on the table face up so he would see it when it rang, and he would not waste the battery lighting the screen to check. He looked at Miss Aurelia. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, not on her face and not on anyone's face in longer than he could remember. It was not gratitude. Gratitude was what people offered when you did them a favor and they understood the transaction. This was not a transaction. This was something that did not have a name in the vocabulary of exchanges between strangers, something that existed in the space between what a person does because they choose to and what a person does because they cannot physically do otherwise, because the wiring will not allow it, because the same architecture that produced the anger and the discipline and the mission also produced the inability to stand in a courthouse hallway and listen to a woman's voice thin to nothing and walk away. "You know something?" Miss Aurelia said. It was not a question. The company that filed your eviction was sued 7 years ago for doing exactly this to other people, Jax said. He said it flat. He said it the way he delivered all information that carried weight, without inflection, without editorializing, because the facts were heavy enough on their own and adding emotion to heavy facts was like adding water to a boat that was already taking on water. They paid a fine. They changed their name. They kept operating. Your son's loan may have been one of the ones they targeted. Miss Aurelia absorbed this. The absorption was visible, a slow settling, the way sediment settles in water that has been disturbed, each particle finding its place in the new arrangement. Her hand was still on Smoky's head. Smoky's muzzle was still on her arm. The contact had not broken since Smoky had first placed it there, and Jax understood that the contact was not incidental. It was structural, It was the foundation on which Miss Aurelia was standing, while the ground beneath her rearranged itself, and without it, without the 8 pounds of a German shepherd's head on her forearm and the warmth of the fur and the steady, measured breathing of an animal that did not know what predatory lending was, and did not need to know because the animal's job was not to understand the threat, but to stand beside the person facing it. Without that contact, the rearrangement would have been a collapse rather than a settling. Robert knew, Miss Aurelia said quietly. He said something once. Near the end, he said, "Mama, I think they took advantage of me, but I fixed it. I paid it off and they can't touch it now." He said that. She paused. She looked at the wall. The wall had nothing on it except a clock that was 11 minutes slow and a fire evacuation map in a plastic frame. He was wrong, she said. He paid it off and they touched it anyway. "Yes, ma'am," Jax said. "But the people I just called have been watching this company for 2 years, if they take your case, and I believe they will. Delta Southern is going to have to prove in court that they own a debt that was paid off 20 years ago through a transfer from a bankrupt company using a filing that may not be legitimate by a company that has already been sued for manufacturing exactly this kind of debt. They will not be able to prove it. You believe that?" "I know the paperwork. The paperwork is on your side." The phone rang. He answered it. The woman from the Delta Fair Housing Project spoke for 3 minutes. She asked specific questions about the filing, the chain of title, the electronic transfer record, the consent decree. Jax answered each one with the same flat precision he had used all morning, and with each answer he could hear the quality of the silence on the other end changing, tightening, focusing. The silence of a person who is hearing something they have been waiting to hear for a long time. "We've been building a case against this company for 2 years, the woman said. "We have 12 other homeowners in 4 counties. We have the pattern. What we have not been able to get is the documentation connecting Delta Southern to the original consent decree. The electronic filing record you're describing with the 2013 transfer date from the bankrupt entity. That's the link. Can you photograph everything and send it to me today?" "Yes, ma'am." "The homeowner needs representation. We can provide it pro bono. I'll have someone at the courthouse tomorrow morning. Can you give me her information?" Jax looked at Miss Aurelia. He held the phone slightly away from his ear so she could hear. She nodded. He gave the woman Miss Aurelia's name and address and phone number. The woman repeated them back. She asked if the eviction had been stayed. Jax said the contest had been filed and the hearing date had not been set. The woman said she would file a motion to stay the eviction pending the hearing. She said the word stay, and the word meant something specific and something temporary, and something that was not a victory, but was the absence of a defeat, which, in the specific economy of legal combat against an entity with more resources, and more time, and more rooms, and more chairs than the person it was grinding, was the most you could hope for on the first day. The call ended. Jax set the phone on the table. 9%. He looked at Miss Aurelia. She was sitting with both hands on the table now, her fingers spread, Smoky's head still resting on her right forearm, and her face held an expression that Jax studied for several seconds, because it was an expression he needed to understand, not for her sake, but for his own. It was the expression of a person who has been pushing against a door for 8 months, and has felt the door move. Not open, move. The distinction was everything. The door moving was not the same as the door opening. The door moving meant the hinges were not rusted shut. It meant the frame was not welded. It meant the door could, with sustained pressure and the right leverage and the right people pushing beside you, eventually open. And the knowledge that it could open after 8 months of believing it could not, was doing something to Miss Aurelia's face that was quiet and internal, and that Jax recognized because he had felt it himself once a long time ago, in a different room, in a different fight, and the feeling was not hope, and was not relief, and was not any of the words that people use when they want to describe the experience of seeing a closed system crack. The feeling was simpler than that. The feeling was, I was right, and nobody believed me, and now someone believes me, and I was right. He stood. Smoky lifted her head from Miss Aurelia's arm. The separation was gentle, unhurried, Smoky withdrawing her weight by degrees rather than all at once, giving the arm time to adjust to the absence, and Miss Aurelia's hand lingered on Smoky's skull for a moment before lifting away, her fingers trailing through the fur with a reluctance that was not sentimental, but was instead the reluctance of a person releasing a support that has been holding them upright in a current that has not yet stopped pushing. "The legal aid people will be here tomorrow morning," Jax said. "They know this company. They have other cases. Your case gives them what they needed. What about you? Miss Aurelia said. Jax did not understand the question. He looked at her. She looked at him the way she had looked at Smoky through the screen door that morning, with the attention of a person who was reading something that most people did not bother to read. You gave up your work today, she said. You've been parked across the road for 11 days, and I've seen you and I didn't think anything of it, because people park and people go, and that's just the road. But you got up and you came across and you've been in this courthouse all morning, and you're not getting paid, and you're not a lawyer, and you don't know me. She paused. So what about you? Jax looked at the floor. He looked at the folder on the table. He looked at Smoky, who was standing beside him, looking up at him with the amber eyes that asked no questions and made no demands and offered no commentary on the choices he made, only the constant, unwavering confirmation that wherever the choices led, she would be there. I'll be all right, he said. It was not true, and it was not false. It was the sentence he used when the truth was a number that came out negative, and the alternative to the sentence was silence. And silence in a room where someone was watching you with the kind of attention Miss Aurelia was watching him with was a kind of answer he was not prepared to give. She studied him for a moment longer. Then she nodded. The nod was not acceptance. It was acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one person who understood what it cost to say, I'll be all right, when the math did not support it, because she had been saying her own version of that sentence for 8 months, and she knew exactly what the words weighed and exactly what they concealed. They walked out of the courthouse together, Jax and Miss Aurelia and Smoky, down the stairs and through the hallway with the fluorescent lights that still hummed at 120 hertz, but that Jax passed through this time without stopping because the mission was between him and the lights now. The mission stood in the hallway like a wall he had built from the morning's work, and the lights hummed against the wall, and the wall held. They pushed through the glass doors, and the heat hit them like a physical barrier, a wall of wet, heavy, motionless air that smelled like asphalt and cut grass and standing water, and Jax squinted against the glare, and Miss Aurelia raised a hand to shade her eyes, and Smoky walked between them. Her stride measured and even her tail low and still, her body radiating the quiet, settled energy of an animal that has completed an operation and is transitioning to recovery. They drove back to Miss Aurelia's house. The truck's cab was an oven. Jax opened both doors and let it breathe for 2 minutes before Miss Aurelia got in, and she sat in the passenger seat with Smoky between them on the bench, and she did not comment on the state of the truck, or the heat, or the cracked dashboard, or the broken seat lever, or any of the markers of a life that had been reduced to its mechanical minimum. She sat in the truck the way she sat in her kitchen, and the way she sat in the courthouse, with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and a dignity that was so deeply embedded in the structure of her bearing that it was indistinguishable from the bearing itself. They arrived at the house. Jax parked in the road, not in her driveway, because the driveway was hers, and he had not been invited to use it. Miss Aurelia got out. She walked to the porch, and she stopped, and she turned, and she looked at Jax through the open passenger window with an expression that he would remember for a long time, an expression that was not gratitude, and was not pity, and was not the complicated, uncomfortable expression that people wore when they were confronted with a man whose circumstances they could see, and whose dignity they did not know how to address. It was the expression of a person seeing another person, simply and completely. Not a homeless veteran, not a charity case, not a story. A man who could read a document and had read it, and had done something with what he read because the alternative was to know and to do nothing, and knowing and doing nothing was a weight that his particular architecture could not carry. "Are you hungry?" she said. "No, ma'am," Jax said. She went inside. She came back out 2 minutes later, carrying a plate covered with a cloth napkin. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard to the gate, and she placed the plate on the top of the gate post balanced carefully on the flat metal cap, and she did not bring it to the truck, and she did not hand it to him, and she did not make it a transaction or an obligation or a debt. She placed it on the gate post, and she turned and walked back to the porch, and she went inside, and the screen door closed behind her with the same soft wooden sound it had made that morning when the world was different. Jax sat in the truck for a moment. Then he got out and walked to the gate and picked up the plate and carried it back to the truck and sat on the tailgate with his legs hanging over the edge and the plate on his knees. Under the napkin was fried chicken and collard greens and cornbread, and the chicken was still warm, and the greens had pot liquor pooling at the edges, and the cornbread was the dense, Slightly sweet kind that is made with buttermilk and cooked in a cast iron skillet, and that does not exist anywhere outside of a kitchen where someone has been making it the same way for 50 years. He ate. He ate slowly, not because he was savoring it, although he was, but because his body had not received food of this quality or this quantity in long enough that the act of eating it required a recalibration, a slowing down, a recognition that the food was real, and the plate was real, and the tailgate was real, and the magnolia tree across the road was throwing its deep circle of shade across Miss Aurelia's yard, and the shade was real too. Smoky sat beside him on the tailgate. He tore a piece of cornbread and held it out, and she took it from his fingers with the precise, gentle mouth of a dog that had been trained to take objects from human hands without applying pressure. A skill that had been designed for retrieving equipment in the field, and that functioned, in this context, as a tenderness that neither of them would have called by that name. The cicadas started early that evening. They came in from the pecan trees in waves, building from the scattered ticking of individual insects into the full pulsing wall of sound that Jax knew would last until morning, the sound that sat at the edge of the other sound, the sound without a name. He was parked in the turnout. The shade had arrived on schedule, the pecan canopies throwing their wedge of shadow across the truck at 2, and the cab had dropped from unsurvivable to merely brutal, and Smoky was on the bench seat with her belly against the vinyl, and her breathing slow and measured, and her amber eyes half closed. The plate was clean. He had washed it at the spigot behind the feed store, and he would return it to Miss Aurelia's gatepost in the morning. His phone was dead. He would charge it tomorrow when he ran the engine. The legal aid people would come to the courthouse in the morning and they would find Miss Aurelia because he had given them her address, and because Miss Aurelia was not a woman who would fail to be where she said she would be. The eviction would be stayed. The house would not be saved yet. That would take months, and lawyers and depositions and the slow, grinding machinery of a legal system that moved at its own speed regardless of what was at stake. But the house was not gone today. Today the door had moved. He had $34. He had missed the work. The math, when he ran it tonight, would come out the same way it came out every night, negative, a number at the bottom of the column that meant something was going to break. 2 days later, Curtis called. He said he had a compressor rebuild and a rear-end job, and he needed a second pair of hands for the week. He said it the way Curtis said everything, flat and without elaboration. And he did not mention the missed days, and he did not ask where Jax had been, and the work he was offering had not been there 2 days ago. And both men knew it had not been there, and neither man said so, because saying so would have made it something it was not, and what it was did not require a name. The cicadas were loud. Jax lay on the bench seat with Smoky's weight against his leg, and the dark pressing against the windows and the sound pressing against the dark. He counted, 4,848. His breathing slowed. Smoky's tail thumped once against the vinyl. 4,849. The count continued, number by number, breath by breath, the thread unbroken, the night survivable, the same as every other night, except for one thing. He was not counting to manage anything. He was just counting. The realization arrived without ceremony, without revelation, without any of the dramatic internal shifts that stories use to signal that a character has changed. It arrived the way the shade arrived at 2 in the afternoon, gradually, by degrees, until it was simply there, present and factual, and requiring no announcement. He was counting because counting was what he did at night, and tonight the counting was not a wall between himself and the sound. Tonight, the counting was just counting. The numbers were just numbers. The breaths were just breaths. And the man lying in the truck in the dark in the Mississippi Delta was not a weapon and not a sacrifice and not a casualty and not a file in a system that had lost his paperwork. He was a man who could read a document and give a damn today. That had been enough. He did not know if it would be enough tomorrow. He did not need to know tonight. Smoky shifted beside him, pressing her flank closer, and her breathing settled into the rhythm that meant she was asleep, truly asleep. The deep operational sleep of an animal that had completed her mission and trusted her handler to hold the watch. He lay in the dark and held the watch and counted, and the counting was easy, and the night was long, and the heat was still there, and the cicadas were still there, and the math was still negative, and none of it had changed except the one thing that had changed, which was that Jax Harlan had been useful today, and the usefulness had cost him everything he had, and everything he had turned out to be exactly enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.